you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Fred, for joining me.
Thank you, Paul. It's a real pleasure to be joining you one of these fireside chats. This is my third one I've had the opportunity to do with you, and this is a very auspicious time to be doing this particular topic. We're going to be talking about an inspiring leader who could do things for people, and starving artists needed their help. And what better person to introduce that time than Paul? So we'll start with that, and then we're going to head into some art work and artists that were saved by the WPA.
Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge our state senator, Russ. Stand up. Russ is a huge supporter of the library and all of the great cultural stuff we do here in Lewis, and he's a real friend and champion to us all. I will say that when Fred and I were working on this, the first draft we put up together was way too long, and so I said, Fred, we're going to have to, cut some slides. And so the next time we got together, I had cut about 5 slides, and Fred had added about 10 slides. That sort of went back and forth. So I hope none of you have dinner reservations. Okay, so the Great Depression, was really the start of this incredible economic crisis in America, and it put more than a quarter of Americans out of work, and it sort of just shut down the whole economic machinery that kept people like artists and actors and painters and dancers, in business. An interesting and unexpected consequence of the Great Depression was that a lot of people started going to museums because, number one, they were, in most cases, free. In the summertime, they were air-conditioned. In the wintertime, they were heated. And so you saw a big spike in public consumption of art. And this was sort of one of the things that got people's attention about how can we expand on this idea of the appeal of museums. So when Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1933, there was this confluence between this desperately needed relief for people who were out of work, including artists, and this awareness and appreciation of public art. Particularly because there were all these newly constructed federal buildings that were going up all across the country that FDR was funding through the Works Project Administration. Now, FDR himself was a very serious art collector. Up at the FDR Library, there's about more than 10,000 pieces of art. A lot of it is naval art. This is his study in the Oval Office. In the White House, you can see all the paintings stacked up here. But he also had a lot of portrait paintings, a lot of landscape, and of course, by the end of his administration, a lot of New Deal art. So the first federal art program, and this is sort of a map of the 16 districts around the country, was called the Public Works of Art Project. And this was a crash relief program that was started essentially under the Treasury Department. The program only lasted 6 months, from December 1933 to June 1934. In that short period of time, it employed 3,700 artists at a cost of about $1.3 million. Now, I actually love this picture. This is Eleanor Roosevelt. She's looking at that map that I just showed you with several other people who were involved. Edward Bruce, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Robert, and Forbes Watson. They were all sort of involved in this art project. And I just love the fact, that she was sort of personally involved with this. And the idea was that how do we expand this effort? It started off, but how do we make it bigger? How do we reach more people? Fred.
So what you're seeing here is the U.S. Customs House in New York. And the vaulted ceiling is, you will see some of the most famous murals that were painted during the WPA. We're going to show you a lot of murals. That's what people think about typically.
A lot.
About WPA art. And these murals, about $500,000 was spent in the first fraction of what was called the Treasury Relief Act for artists. It funded over 275 artists. 75% of those artists were on relief. And they were paid typically $69 to $100 a month. But most of them didn't have lunch money or bus money. So it really kept them alive and kept them doing art. This program lasts till 1939. These particular murals, you can go see them. They're still there. The building is now the New York branch of the Smithsonian and the National Archives. At least it was last week. There are 8.
It's being turned into a casino.
Yeah. There are 8 scenes of the New York Harbor, and there are 8 scenes of great navigators. And it's considered one of the best sets of murals done by WA by Reginald Morris. So the Federal Arts Project was the largest of FDR's WPA programs that helped support artists. It replaced the Public Works Project. And it had several different programs. One of them was called the section of painting and sculpture, later recalled the section of fine arts. It was created by Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, primarily to obtain paintings and sculptures for these new federal buildings that were being built, primarily in Washington, New York, but other cities too. And if you think about it, this program still exists, although it's largely privately funded. Many cities like New York and Boston and Philly, when a big building goes up, they donate about 0.5% of the building's costs to public art. So this program started in 34, ended in 43. 1,400 contracts were set out to artists, and it cost $2.5 million. If you want to put that in today's money, multiplied by about 25.
So the federal arts projects supported a wide variety of arts, and we're only going to look at sort of the visual arts today, but they supported musicians, they supported poets, dancers. Within the arts, they included murals, sculptures, graphic arts, and then printmaking, interior art for federal buildings, and interestingly, an index of all the projects, as well as what they called easel arts and then public exhibitions of some of this art. It was started in 1935, employed more than 35,000 people and cost $35 million. And it lasted also until 1943. There was a war going on or something. They cut all these programs. But it was significant because so much of it still exists today. So some of the most visible and durable of these programs are the murals in public buildings. This is from one in Poughkeepsie. It was painted by Georgina Kilgard. And of course, this was Roosevelt's hometown. And he wanted the art in these public buildings to reflect the local history. And so almost all of them, particularly in buildings where there were multiple panels, they would tell a chronological history or a history of the area. And he felt very strongly about this. And there were about 850 artists created about 1,300 murals. And 162 of those artists were women. Only 3 were African American. But it was an enormous project. So this is the one, this is called the steel industry. And this is in the courthouse and post office in Pittsburgh. It's 17 feet wide and 10 feet high. And this is sort of very typical of the style of these murals. He went on to produce an exhibition in the Army at War and other things by the Treasury Department. Quite remarkable work. This is one from the Dover Post Office, if you've ever been to Dover. It's called Harvest Spring and Summer, painted by William D. White. It's no longer in the post office. It's now the Wesley Methodist Church, but it's still there. And this is just another angle of, you can see how they sort of painted into a corner. They do a lot of interesting challenges because of the doors and windows and ceilings that they had to work around.
I should add that White is a fairly well-known Delaware artist. He's from Wilmington. And the Biggs Museum in 2015 did a retrospective on him.
So the murals from that time reflect a very different artistic and political sensitivities. And today there is a lot of controversy around the depictions, particularly of indigenous people and enslaved people. This is called French Explorers and Indians by Carl R. Free, and it's at the Ariel Rios Federal Building in Washington, D.C. It wasn't called that back then. And this idea about imposing contemporary artistic and political standards on art created 80 years ago has led to some, controversies.
And this is a controversy that will illustrate that point. This is a mural in Jackson, Georgia, that was painted by Philip Evergood. He was a well-known American artist. He studied at the Art Student League in New York with two of the most famous artists from the Ashcan School, John Sloan and George Lux. This mural is entitled Cotton from the Field to the Mill. And since it depicted enslaved people picking the cotton, it was viewed as offensive. So in 220, they did this. That's all they did. And in other post offices where there was some controversy about the political correctness of one of these murals, they would often just put a sign saying this was painted in 1934 and explain why it's there. Here in 220, all they did was cover it with tarp, and with numerous complaints from the local post office up through the national headquarters, they've yet to explain why they did this and what they're going to do with it. So 5 years later, it's still covered with a tarp. Now, this is a more appropriate mural. This is from Geneva, New York. It's by Peter Bloom, again, a very well-known artist, again studied at the Art Student League in New York, had a Guggenheim Fellowship in Italy. He did 3 murals for post offices. This one's in Geneva, and so it's very appropriate that it has grapevines for upstate New York. Now, this is in the Department of the Interior building here in Washington, which still contains one of the largest collections of New Deal art, and by some of the finest American artists at the time. This is by William Gropper, and he painted this enormous 3-panel mural to honor the Bureau of Reclamation. It's basically a story of building the Grand Coulee Dam. Another one of the well-known mural artists, this is Kindred McLeary, and you can barely make out the present state of the mural on the left. This is in the Madison Square Garden Post Office in New York, and there's a half a dozen murals in this building, but you can barely see them. They're so covered with grime, and there's water leaking on them from the roof. So on the right is what the mural looks like. Kindred McLeary was, again, another hallowed artist. He was educated in Paris, and he also did murals for the Siegfried Follies. We go on to Edward Lanning. Now, these murals are in better shape because they're there in the New York Public Library. This is called Morgenthaler and the Linotype. If you remember, Morgenthaler invented the Linotype. And we move on to Seymour Fogel. This is called The Security of the People. It's a marvelous mural that shows what the government does for us when the government is functioning. It's appropriately in the Social Security building, the Cohen building, and he was the guy who started Medicare in the 60s. Well, Fogel and his fellow artist who painted an adjacent mural, both apprenticed with Diego Rivera, who at the time was painting murals for the Rockefeller Center, but when David Rockefeller saw the murals, he had them painted over. We stay in Washington. This is the Department of Justice building, the Robert F. Kennedy building. On either side of the Attorney General's conference room are two very large murals. This one is called The Feet of Justice, and I don't know if you can make out, it's a pretty macabre scene. People don't look too happy there, but on the other side of the conference room is the triumph of justice. And the man in the robe comforting the lady in white, the model used for the man in the robe was Justice Harlan Stone. The artist Leon Kroll, he again studied in the Art Student League. He studied in Paris. And after the war, he did the mosaic mural for the Normandy Chapel. We go on to another famous artist who became famous because of his work done for the WPA, and that's Arshile Gorky.
He was a graffiti artist before graffiti.
That's right. He was an Armenian who moved to New York in 1920. A lot of the artists we're talking about today, I want to remind you, were immigrants coming into New York. And he befriended de Kooning and Pollack and became one of the people who helped form abstract expressionism. His art is revered today. Unfortunately, a lot of it was lost in a fire in his studio and in a plane crash when they were moving a lot of his art to a museum setup. But here is two that remain in the Newark Museum. During the WPA, he was asked to do 10 murals for the Newark Airport Administration Building. And he was the first. You can see it's a very different style mural than the ones we showed you before, kind of social realism. These are really modernistic. And of the 10 he painted for the Newark Airport, only these two remain. They were found under 14 layers of white paint when the building was renovated in 1973. So we move back to Edward Lanning. We talked about him before at the New York Public Library. This is one of his best-known murals at Ellis Island. He also studied the Art Student League with John Sloan. And this painting is part of 8 murals he did for the Ellis Island dining room. The series was entitled The Role of the Immigrant in the Industrial Development of America. Think of those words in today's. And here's a picture of the dining room. You can barely see that the walls are covered with these murals. Terrible name for the dining room, the Aliens Dining Room. And then we come back to
where Men in Black got their idea for,
We come back to a local mural. This is from the Rehoboth Post Office. It's entitled Frontier Mail. And sorry, we don't have a better photograph of it. It's done by Carl Knapp, who was one of the most famous artists to come out of the Provincetown Art Colony, America's first art colony. It was formed in 1900. And during World War I, he really started a whole series of new art forms, American art forms.
All right, moving on to sculpture.
Okay. This is Robert Cronbach. He was trained in sculpture at the St. Louis Academy of Art and the Pennsylvania Art Academy in the 1920s. He taught sculpture for many years after the WPA and the war years at Adelphi University. Didn't die until 2001. This is a model, a plaster model of a sculpture that he won in a national competition to do for the new Social Security building. Now, many of the larger art enterprises, big murals and sculptures, there were national contests. So he won this contest, and he was given $16,000 to make 2 8-foot bronze sculptures and deliver them to the new Social Security building. By the time he delivered it in January 42, as Paul mentioned, we were otherwise occupied, and the Social Security building was taken over by the War Department. And he didn't think a room full of desks would would be graced by these two large sculptures. So they were put in a warehouse. They're still there in some warehouse. The artist has yet to find out what happened to them.
So this is a sculpture. You can see much more of a modern aesthetic here by Jose de Rivera. It's called Bird. And Fred's already mentioned the Newark Airport. There was a lot of art put into the Newark Airport in 1938. That's where this was installed. It's now in the permanent collection of the Newark Art Museum. And this is one of those, this was not done during the time, this was actually done in 1967, also by Jose de Rivera. But this is outside the Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. Many of you may have seen this. I used to walk by this all the time when I worked at the museum. For those of you who are familiar with the National Mall down there, there's a lot of beautiful outside sculpture. And although, again, this wasn't funded during that program, it shows that these artists who were supported continued to produce art, for decades. So 1939 World's Fair is a very interesting sort of stopping place in this story because FDR wanted there to be this sort of grand plaza. And there was much debate about how they were going to do this and should we be spending money? We're just coming out of the Great Depression. But the Grand Plaza was called Freedom Plaza. And there were 4 large statues that you can see there. And they were the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, and freedom of assembly. Now, I've always felt that this collection of statues and the concept behind them were one of the things that inspired FDR to write the famous 4 Freedoms speech that he gave in January of 1941, in which he sort of took this idea and used it as a way to justify what America needed to understand about the world. And to give you some sense of scale, those are people, down at the bottom there. These were enormous statues. They were designed by Leo Friedlander, and I could not find out what had happened to them. Now, the World's Fair was something of a financial failure. It was popular, but they just could never really recoup their losses. And so I'm not sure what happened to a lot of the material. But so we don't know what happened to these statues, but I do know that they were involved in the creation of the 4 Freedoms, which of course went on to provide the basis for the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a number of other things. So that's a case where the sculpture really did live on in our political lives.
So now we're going to move on to the graphic arts division. We leave sculpture and we go on to graphic arts, which was mainly printing. And here, a building in downtown New York City was devoted to printing. And this building was originally set up for other type of WPA activities. And when artists were asked to come, they were asked to sign in on a time card. And if they had to go out to sketch something, they had to say where they were going. And they were told that somebody might check up on them. And
all the things artists love.
So that didn't last very long when people realized who were running it that artists don't work that way. But this print shop really revitalized printmaking in this country. Printmaking was always a second cousin to easel art. Print, you roll something and you get a cheap paper copy. That isn't what a lithograph is. That's not what a woodcut is. And this studio was set up with all the equipment to do lithographs and woodcuts and printing and screen printing. And it launched the career of some of the most famous print artists in this country, one of whom is shown here, Fritz Eichenberg. And that's just a marvelous scene of having a good time in New York City. It's what people think about when they're on Broadway, right? It's a woodcut. And the next one is, again, the art scene. This is Aline Freehoff, Martha Graham's picture of Martha Graham's dance studio. Marvelous scenes of the arts in New York. But, you know, this is the 30s, the Depression, and the drought in the Midwest is on. And so here is a woodcut from Jacob Kanan, who went on to become, again, a very famous print artist and head of the graphics division of the Smithsonian. This is simply called, the one before it, Drought. Okay? So go on to something a little looks frivolous, but Stuart Davis became, he was unknown when he was working in this print shop, but he was trying things very differently. This is almost lyrical with its colors and its shapes. Davis was known for bridging modern European art and modern American art. This particular lithograph was originally placed in a DC public school. It is now safely in the Smithsonian. I have another one here. I think the next one is a Stuart Davis print called Men and Machine, and you can just see it's two guys, you know, building something. You can make that out, but it's lyrical and it's very simple use of shapes and colors. And the next print artist is Louis Schenker. This is called St. George and the Dragon. He was another one of the early abstractionists. He was a cohort of Mark Rothko and Milton Avery. And he worked in many media other than prints, but his color prints are widely appreciated because of the wonderful, vibrant colors they show. And his colleague in the print shop was Hyman Warsager. This one is called simply Staten Island, and it makes Staten Island look beautiful.
It never looked that good. Never.
Warsager's color prints were included in a 1940 book entitled Color Prints for Under $10. And don't you wish your grandparents had bought a few of them, okay? So here is another one called Boating, and this is owned by the Smithsonian, but they don't have a color print of it on their website because, again, is these beautiful, vibrant colors, and you just look at that. That's life right there. The other part of what happened in the King Street studio was inventing the technology to do mass production of silk screen posters, okay, by having a technique that allowed you to produce a artistic version in vibrant colors that you could mass produce, enabled posters to be put all over town, such as these, advertising women at work during the war or a school exhibit. And this became a very important follow-through of what the King Street print shop enabled to happen. And of course, a lot of these artists during the war went on to continue to do artwork for the war, the drafting posters, camouflage work. So it didn't end with the WPA. So
they transitioned into the Office of War Information. And sometimes even the same shops, they would just put a new nameplate on. The funding was coming from the Pentagon now. But so many of those classic World War II posters were done by the same people who had been employed during the Great Depression.
So I think I've told you all the things about the legacy of this studio. Over 9,000 pieces of work were made. My favorite print artist is this lady, Blanche Lazelle. She didn't work in New York. She worked in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and she's the most famous artist known for the so-called white line woodcut print. That's the kind of woodcut that I do and I teach here in the library at Rehoboth Art League. She lived in 1955, would sell these beautiful prints in Provincetown for tourists coming over to Boston for $5 each. The latest to go up in auction went for $250,000.
Talk to your grandparents, see if any of them accidentally got one of those.
This print of, go back a bit, Paul. This print of Lazelle's was found in a closet in Massachusetts when a gentleman was cleaning out his father's house. And he picked it up and looked at it and turned it over, and it said GSA on the back. No, it said WPA on the back. And so he rightly returned it to the GSA, the rightful owner of that. Blanche also worked for the WPA, but in Provincetown and in her hometown of Morgantown, West Virginia. The print on the left is called Monongahela. And of course, it's the river. You see the swiping curve of the river, the swiping curves of the mountains and the trees. It's really modern art. Lazelle was the first to bring Cubism over to the US. She was known as a modern artist. But when she went to work for the WPA in Morgantown, the local administrator said, none of that fancy modern European stuff, stick to the basics. So the print on the right is one she did in Morgantown. You can see it's got the rivers and the factories. It's kind of dull. But she was paid $28 a week to do these things, and it kept her alive. Now, printmaking also happened in the Federal Art Projects studios in the Northwest. And I'm going to show you two of the famous printmakers from the Northwest. One is Corwin Chase. These are full color woodcut prints that are made by carving a wood block for every color. So there's 14 different wood blocks shown in that print. He and his brother did these. One liked to carve and the other liked to print. So they had a nice partnership. The second artist from the Northwest, Elizabeth Colburn, very well known. It's called Moon on the Stream. She did the sketching, the carving, and the printing all by herself. And these were, again, supported by the WPA and kept these artists alive.
Now, the WPA obviously is well known for the big projects, the dams and the lodges and the national parks. So this is Timberline Lodge near Mount Hood in Oregon. And it's a wonderful example of the integration of a wide range of federally funded projects. There was the architecture, there was the construction, there was the interior design, there was the art. And it's a great story in that it's almost unlike any other building. So this is the interior. As you can see, it's quite dramatic, and it has a little bit of an indigenous, Northwest indigenous peoples aesthetic to it. They had the big tent pole lodges that they would live in, and you can see the use of wood, this big center column. So in early fall 1937, Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt traveled across the country to visit a number of sites. They went to Oregon to dedicate the Bonneville Dam, and then they came to Timberline Lodge. You can see their motorcade arriving there. And this was something that FDR took enormous pride and promotion for these buildings, these dams, all these things of putting people back to work, and he wanted to make sure people understood how important these were to the American infrastructure. And so when he got there, he gave a speech, and he said, quote, "The Timberline Lodge marks a venture made possible by the WPA and the Federal Art Project in order that we may test the workability of recreational facilities installed by the government itself and operated under its complete control." So the idea was that this was not a commercial entity. They weren't trying to make money. They were trying to create a national asset for the use of citizens. And again, in this part of Oregon, if you've ever been out to Mount Hood, I mean, this is a fairly rural. It was very, very hard hit during the Depression because a lot of people worked in the lumber industry. Nobody was building houses. Nobody was cutting down trees. So this really served a number of purposes. And if you look at the art, So the art is totally integrated into the rooms, you know, and there's hundreds of pieces throughout this enormous lodge. And to give you, I mean, this gives you a little bit of sense, but I love this picture. So this is a painting behind a sofa, right? And like Frank Lloyd Wright, you know, they designed all the furniture for this building as well. And if you look closely, it has what I think of as sort of quintessential human figures in this WPA style. You know, it combines geometric shapes and colors and this real sense of stylized human forms. You know, it hints at the Art Deco movement, but it really is sort of unique, I think, to this WPA, FPA aesthetic.
If you haven't been to the Timberline Lodge, please make a trip. I remember the first time I went there, I walked in and it's breathtaking. You don't want to leave the lobby. It's such a remarkable building. Everything about it, as Paul said, the couch, the furniture, the lamps, the lamp works. So go take a visit sometime. Okay, we're going to move to the so-called easel division. These were the artists who painted with an easel. And this division really launched modern art in this country. We'll start with, there's a whole list of artists here, but we're only going to do a few of them, thankfully. We'll
he
come back
to do them all. He wanted 10 pictures of every artist. No, I'm sorry.
Hey, they're not paying for it, right? Yeah. Here we're coming back to Stuart Davis. Again, he called his early artwork configuration theory because he was matching so much color and shape into there. They're just remarkable. You just stare at these things for hours. The next artist you've heard of, Jackson Pollack, right? Doesn't that remind you of a Jackson Pollack piece? Okay. So he worked for the WPA in the 30s. This is called Cotton Pickers. Okay. And this is what the next one is, what you know Jackson Pollack for, right? This is called Number 1A 1948. When he started these types of paintings, he refused to title them because he didn't want the viewer to misinterpret his art. So he just numbered them. Now, this next fellow you've heard of, Mark Rothko, all right? The one on the left he did for the WPA is called Subway, very inventive, okay? He would go down to the subway and just sketch people. Here's another one called Subway, okay, on the left, but the one on the right is what we now know as a Mark Rothko type of painting. And his kids gave most of his artwork to the National Gallery of Art. So go down and see him sometime.
If you ever get a chance to visit the Rothko Chapel, it's also quite remarkable. And it has this amazing aesthetic and very spiritual space. His transformation perhaps is one of the most remarkable of all the artists.
So we also want to highlight women artists. So the next, Doris Lee, the one on the painting on the left that looks like a Norman Rockwell print or a Grandma Moses picture is called, fittingly enough, Thanksgiving. And in 1935, she won the first prize for a contest in the Art Institute of Chicago, despite the fact that the Art Institute's director hated the painting. Luckily, she went on, didn't give up art. The next slide shows two of hers. First one is called Johnny Appleseed, very much in the social realist style of many of the artists we talked about. But on the right, it's called The Violinist. And this is more of what we think about when you see a Doris Lee painting. She really was one of the early modernists, worked with people like Milton Avery to adapt that style. Spent her remaining years after the WPA work at the famous art colony in Woodstock, New York, but also painted a mural in Washington. So. Next is Alice Neal, a very famous artist who was with us to 1984. The portrait on the left is called Max White, after a pseudonym for one of her writer friends. On the right, it's called Benny and Mary Ellen. She did portraits, many portraits, but she refused to call herself a portrait painter. She said she was an artist who painted pictures of people. And we come back to John Sloan. We mentioned him early before, probably one of the most famous American artists. This is called, even he had to work for the WPA in the 30s. It's called 14th Street at 6th Avenue in New York. Curiously, this piece of art ended up in the office of a conservative Democratic senator from New York called Royal S. Copeland. And he was very connected to Tammany Hall, so you can probably imagine what he did in the Senate. He died in 1938, and when his office was vacated, this Sloan painting was thrown into a dumpster. But luckily, a very astute and artistically trained congressional staffer picked it out, and it remained in private hands for almost 60 years before it was finally returned to the Government Services Administration. Not before it took a slight detour to the Antiques Roadshow, and it was evaluated at $750,000. So the last easel artist we want to talk about is Arthur Getz. This is a study for a mural he did, and Paul and I would stare at this while we were preparing this talk. It's just a wonderful painting. You might not know Arthur Getz until I remind you that he was the most prolific cover artist for New Yorker. He did more than 200 covers for New Yorker from the 1950s through the end of the 80s. This particular print was auctioned, this painting was auctioned off by Swan Auctions in May of 2021, but I couldn't find out what it went for. Sorry about that.
It's really a shame that they never made a mural out of this. You know, I think the motion and the color and the sense of movement and energy is just terrific, and it really does sort of capture a lot of what the Federal Art Project art was designed to do. Excuse me. So I would say I had never heard of this before, and when Fred explained it to me, I was like, "You're kidding me!" So one of their big projects was the Index of American Design. In other words, all the stuff that they were creating, someone had to draw a picture of what was done and put it in this index.
Can you see there? There's a guy painting a picture of a vase on one side, and there's a lady painting a picture of a windmill, wind vane.
Thank God they didn't do it on index cards, right? I mean, and so this was an enormous project, if you can imagine, sort of indexing all of the art that the federal government owned, you know. And now some people would claim that this was a, you know, make work kind of project, but it's the only record that exists of what the government owned. When did they stop doing this?
I don't know, but the GSA last published the index in the 90s, I think, and they only covered 43,000 pieces of art, half of what they thought they indexed.
Right.
And we're waiting for volume 2.
So here you go. And they didn't just, you know, draw these things and then put them in a file somewhere. It had to be reviewed and graded. Here's the teacher, you know, putting a mark on this. How'd you like to be that artist sitting there going, "Well, you're lying over here"?
Yeah, and the artist is Mark Rothko or Jackson Pollack, right?
Right. So they would, anyway, so in addition, you know, there were these public exhibitions. I go back to the very beginning. A lot of Americans were going to museums. They were experiencing art. All of a sudden, you had this poster art showing up in all sorts of places, bus stops and schools and libraries and post offices. And then you also, of course, had the art that was good enough to be put on exhibit in these museums. And so this is American abstract artist at the Squibb Building in New York City in 1937. And this one,
that is the World's Fair again, in the Hall of Medicine, and It's by Ilya Bolotowski. May not have heard that artist's name, but he again was a very early proponent of abstract painting, along with Shankar, I showed you before, and with Rothko. He was strongly influenced by Piet Mondrian. And this particular painting was originally done for the Williamsburg housing project, but it got more of a showing at the World's Fair. So here's another World's Fair poster by Philip Guston called Maintaining America's Skills. It was on one of the buildings in the fair. And that name may not ring a bell to you until I recount a story that 5 European and American museums in 220 were about to launch a major retrospective of Guston's work. I mean, he died in 1980, but he's one of the most famous American artists. He was a social realist, so there were a lot of paintings of racial incidents in the South, the KKK. And when the show was supposed to open, there was such a hue and cry that the opening was postponed for 2 years. So the show eventually did happen. Oh, yeah. So what we really haven't mentioned is in addition to the WBA funding artists to do their own art, the Federal Art Project funded artists to go out to schools and to teach art and to show art. And here's just a painting demonstration at the World's Fair, where they, again, you know, these artists are being paid to do this, and they welcomed that pay.
Okay, look at this. We're on time, Rebecca. I bet you're surprised. So we're going to wrap up here, but there's 2 stories we want to tell. Now, do you all know who Phil Kennicott is? He's the culture reporter for the Washington Post, does a lot of museum reviews. He did a great article in March called What It Could Mean for the Government to Abandon Its Huge Art Collection. I highly recommend you look it up and read it. It's really interesting in terms of what is the role of a federal government? Is the role of our government to collect art, to store it, to fund museums? People have different opinions, but this article definitely makes you think about the national asset that has been created in the 250 years of our existence, and what responsibility as citizens we have, as well as what the government has. So he talks about that there were nearly 200,000 artworks were created under the Federal Art Project. Many of those works have since become lost or destroyed, but much of the country was able to really experience art in person for the first time during the Great Depression. And then, in some ways, its most enduring legacy is that it fostered this group of young artists, as Fred has been telling you, saw that list, who really created the second half of 20th century art. I mean, they were the ones who transformed what we thought of as traditional art. And it's not just the famous artists, the de Koonings and the Rothkos. Those graphic artists and the printmakers went on to staff Madison Avenue, right? And all of the commercial applications of this graphic art design. And as technology got better and better and better, they created a foundation of this very high level of creative talent and inspiration that was in magazines and in billboards and eventually on television. And so we really have so much to be thankful for of how those artists were sustained during the Great Depression and the great legacy they've left us. And Fred has a story about that legacy. We'll end with that.
You can imagine with the start of World War II, the federal art program had to be shut down very quickly, and it was shut down rather haphazardly across the country. The index project wasn't finished. A lot of the artwork was just put up in bundles. And there's a story about some of the New York art being put in warehouses in Queens in basically big laundry carts. And it was sold by the pound. And there's a
Was
story.
more expensive than bologna, but less expensive than roast beef.
Supposedly, a local plumber purchased a large number of these paintings, and he thought, well, these are used canvases. I can use these to insulate pipes. But he found that his customers started complaining because when they insulated hot water pipes, the paint started to melt and smell. So that didn't work very well. Well, there was another buyer of these big carts of art, Herbert Benavie. He was the owner of a local frame shop, and he purchased paintings for the frames at $3 per canvas. And among the paintings he bought were Milton Avery, Mark Rothko, and Jackson Pollack for $3 a canvas.
And with that, we'll take audience questions and questions from the.
Look, we covered a lot in 50 minutes, and if you want to learn more, there's two really good references. One of the people from the King Street print shop wrote a very nice book, Francis O'Connor, and it was published by the New York Graphic Society, went out of print. The Smithsonian reprinted it. It's out of print, but you can find it for about $20 in any of the ABE books. And just 2 years ago, Yale Press did a book called Art for the Millions, a more modern version of this. So if you want to learn more, two very nice references.
Okay, we got questions. Put your hand up. If you have art you'd like to show, I'll buy it for $3. $3 going once, $3 going twice. Okay, over on the left side there.
Hi, thanks for all the wonderful content you just showed us. I was thinking about what you said about the legacy that is being left behind for all of us. And it makes me wonder more about the artists. How was it determined who got the funding, who the artists were, who got to create this art? And then secondly, was there any sort of through line on a theme? Did they have to just paint something related to America? Was it American pride? Was there any requirement locally or federally?
You take the first, I'll take the second.
Okay, so I can tell you related stories from the King Street. For the most part, when the doors opened, any artist could walk in and sign up. And when it started, they had to show a sketch of what they were going to do to the art supervisor and have it approved. And after the first couple of months, that stopped. But as long as they showed up, and for a while they were required to produce one piece of art a month, but that went by the wayside too after they realized these are artists and they're producing good work. Now, things like the murals were more involved, and the sculptures, there were competitions, and they chose the artists for those particular pieces of work.
But as we said earlier on, when the 3,500 artists that had been hired, 120 or so were women, only 3 were African Americans. So it was very difficult for people of color to get access to this funding through the Federal Art Project. It was just because of the administrators. They were almost all white, and they gave them to people they know. In terms of the theme, that's a great question, because there was no instruction. The intent was not propaganda the way it was during World War II, when the Office of War Information was using posters and things to inspire the American public, give money to war bonds. It really was much more about representing the local community. If there was a criteria, both with the WPA in terms of the buildings they built, they were always encouraged to use local materials, reflect the local architectural design or the local cultural design. And if there were things like the murals, they were strongly encouraged to tell the history of that community. So those were the only sort of themes around it. Now, as we were talking about some of the controversy, the issues today have become that, the story of the history of Poughkeepsie as told by white landowners in 1935 is not the same history we would tell today, right? And so this issue now about who was included and who was excluded from these depictions and how the people who were included were depicted, particularly enslaved people, that really makes you question how aesthetics evolve over time and how much aesthetics are driven by politics, and how much aesthetics can push politics in a different direction. And so, if you ever go out to like New Mexico and look at some of those great lodges there, or if you go to California, or if you go to Michigan, you'll see they all have a similar sort of grand concept, but they reflect those communities in a way that modern architecture really rarely does. I think we had another question over there.
Sort of a follow-up to the previous questions. When we were looking at, when we were looking at the murals in the federal buildings, were the artists directed with a mission, did it have to bring out something about what the purpose of that building was? Was there a connection beyond the community connection? Was there a connection to the work being accomplished in that building? And did they have to show what they would do ahead of actually performing their artwork?
Yeah. Good question. Again, for the murals in the new federal buildings, there were competitions. So William Gropper's mural of the building of the Grand Coulee Dam was going to be in the Department of Interior. Okay, so the mural topics did have a connection to what that department was. So these were competitions, and the artists had to put in a design, and they were chosen to do it. Not the details, but the particular subject matter. Okay. Yeah.
And I think particularly for the federal buildings, which had a slightly different sort of agenda than a mural in a post office, where they really wanted that to reflect the local community. Many of the murals in the big federal buildings were designed to inspire people in terms of labor, in terms of, as he showed a couple, the idea of security, the idea of participation. And there's so many of them where you see people building things or farming or cutting trees, and doing things that were all part of the recovery effort during the Great Depression, right? Because the whole idea was people were out of work, people were starving, people were homeless. We want to acknowledge the fact that we're putting people back to work, and that what makes America great is this work ethic, this ability to be productive. So there was, particularly in the federal buildings, much more of a sense of we're trying to show progress and we're trying to show what we're doing, whereas I think with the regional buildings and the regional art, it was much more about tell the story of your community. Do we have another question? You have an online question?
We do have an online question. What kind of compensation were they paid?
Well, it varied from about $50 a month to maybe $200 a month, but they were paid at basically a similar rate that day laborers were paid at. So if you think about the CCC boys in the earlier part of they were given $1 a day to go out and, cut trees and make roads. So it was $30 or so a month. So it probably in the early part of the 30s probably started in that range around $50, but it went up. I mean, some artists, if you're doing the murals in the Customs House in New York City, you're probably being paid at a higher scale than a guy, doing white line prints in Rhode Island.
So to say.
Sorry. Yeah. Cheap shot. I know. All right, we have one more question. We have 1 minute left.
One on. How did they discover the murals under 10 layers, or was it 14 layers?
14 layers.
14 layers of white paint. Did they already know they were there?
Very carefully, short answer. They knew that there were 10 paintings done by Arshio Gorky in that building. But, that was painted in the 30s, and this is in the 70s when they're reclaiming the building. Apparently, they were only able to find 2 of the 10 that were originally put there, under 14 layers of paint. Now, taking off 14 layers of paint and ending up with that beautiful piece of art I showed you. That's a skilled paint remover. If you want to see those two pieces of art, they're in the Newark Museum of Art.
We get a round of applause for Fred. He's great, isn't he? I love this guy.
And another one for the host of the Fireside Chat. Okay.